Here we have two extraordinary portraits by Irma Stern, both of the same sitter, a woman called Freda Feldman. Freda and her husband Richard are very good friends of Irma Stern's. They were based in Johannesburg. They had a beautiful home in Houghton, which was a hub of Jewish intellectual and cultural life in Johannesburg at the time. Irma often visited the Feldmans in their home in Johannesburg, and in fact when she was visiting, their dining room would be given over to Irma for her paintings. And in fact the walls of the dining room were painted a kind of deep celadon green, all the better to offset the kind of lush still lives and other works that Irma would paint while she was visiting them. And both of these were painted in 1943. They're very different in mood, but I think both of them show a very strong sense of the character of Freda Feldman. These paintings then are Freda Feldman very much in keeping with the kinds of portraits that she did of people in her social and cultural milieu. But I think overlaid on that is a sense of an intensely personal engagement. She was very close to Freda. Many writers have commented on the fact that although the portrait was such an important part of Irma Stern's oeuvre, she painted a huge number of portraits, whether of people she knew or of the so-called exotic others. She never ever painted a self-portrait. Now, you know, one wants to avoid kind of getting into sort of pop psychology around these things, but one might argue, as indeed some people have done, that in a sense she was almost sublimating her own concerns about her, or rather her inferiority complex about her appearance. She was overweight most of her life, she wasn't particularly attractive, she had a very overbearing personality. And these things are often very much, or rather those facts about her, are often very much at odds with the paintings that she produced, which are so lush and so beautiful and so sensuous and so very, very exotic. And particularly portraits like these, or particularly rather the portrait like this with Freda and a bowl of roses. Flowers, of course, very important to Irma Stern always, but also very important to Freda. With Freda, she shared a love of gardening and a love of flowers. So we see Freda presented here very elegant, beautifully dressed, very elegantly manicured and made up, with the bowl of roses. And rather strange, kind of strangely intimate portraits, almost like we're drawn right into Freda's personal space, where she becomes one with the flowers that she's presenting, which again is offset by the sort of slightly floral pattern on the black ground of her dress. So for me, this painting is more than just a portrait of someone that Irma Stern knew. It's almost like a celebration of that person. It's a celebration of friendship. It's a celebration of a kind of femininity. And one can see in a sense, that kind of sense of the sublimation of Irma Stern's own sense of who she was and how she would like to have seen that mirrored in this very beautiful portrait of her friend. The second portrait here is very different in tone and mood. It's called Freda in a khaki dress. And we see, again, it's a much more introspective painting in many ways. An expression that is quite elusive. It's difficult to say exactly what kind of thought Freda's holding in her head in this painting. And again, the almost drab greenness of the dress, which is offset to some extent by this little jeweled brooch of a cockerel. And again, just the presence of the brooch is again a kind of implicit link between them in the way that the flowers are in the other painting, in that both Irma and Freda had a real enjoyment of big, chunky, brightly colored jewelry. So in a sense, again, there's a kind of that interpolation of herself to some extent into the painting. Painted both, as I said, painted in 1943, obviously at the height of the Second World War. And again, a very different mood, this idea of the sort of khaki dress. If one imagines that, you know, this was the 1940s, it was wartime, khaki was omnipresent in uniforms of soldiers going off to the front or returning, or service people around the city. So in a sense, putting Freda into a certain kind of context, a much more elusive expression, and certainly a very, very compelling portrait. The intense blue of Freda's eyes really blends a kind of a soulfulness to the portrait. And interestingly, Freda wasn't aware of this portrait until the 1960s. That although they were both made at roundabout, obviously at the same sitting in Freda's home in the 1940s, Freda only became aware of this portrait close, near to Irma's death in the mid-60s, when people from the Adel Fielding Gallery contacted her and said, you know, we have this portrait, can you verify it for us? So Freda wrote to Irma Stern to ask after it. And Irma Stern wrote back in one of the last letters she ever wrote to Freda, saying, I'm not aware of any paintings that, you know, that I didn't give you or didn't work, you know, that I made without your knowledge. So quite interesting that Irma Stern kept this painting to herself. And I think once again it speaks about the closeness of the bond between the two women. And I suppose in an indirect way is about as close I think we can get to a self-portrait of Irma Stern.